Hello and welcome to another exciting video. In this one, we'll be looking at how we can make use of lazy initialization with useState. So, something that's important to recognize is that every time we are calling the state updater function like setName over here, that will trigger a re-render of the component that manages that state. So here we are talking about the greeting component. This is exactly what we want to have happen, but it can be a problem in some situations, and there are some optimizations we can apply for useState, specifically in the event that it is a problem. In our case, we are reading into local storage.getItem to initialize our state value for the first render of our greeting component. But after that first render, we don't need to read into local storage anymore because we are managing that state in memory now, specifically in that name variable that we have over here. So reading into local storage on every render after the first one is unnecessary. Now React allows us to specify a function instead of an actual value, and then it will only call that function when it needs to on the initial render. In this lesson, we'll see how to do this and demonstrate how it works. So one thing that's important to know about the useState hook is that the initial value you provide here is really important for the initial render of our component. But then it's ignored for renders of our component thereafter. That's normally not a problem, especially if you have just an empty string here. But here we are reading into local storage every time our greeting component is re-rendered. For example, I can go ahead and add console.log over here, and if I now save this, let's go ahead and make some changes over here. You can see that it has called this render method 5 times. So on every change, it is getting rendered and this is being called. So basically the render component is being called every time we type a character. We only needed to read into local storage for the initialization of our state. We don't need to have it read into local storage for every single time we re-render. This isn't really a huge deal here because reading into local storage is pretty fast and we are not parsing anything. But if we were parsing a big JSON object, then this could be a problem. Now to combat this, React.useState has a lazy initialization feature. So over here, you can see that in the updated iteration, we are making use of that feature. Now this function will only be called when it's absolutely necessary to retrieve the initial value. Over here, you can see that we have turned this into an arrow function, which simply returns the initial value. Then we save this. We'll notice that we're still getting our renders, but this function is not getting called except on the initial value retrieval. And to demonstrate that, we have this console.log, and over here we have another console.log. So every time the component renders, this gets called, and every time this method within the component gets called, this is going to be printed in the console. So over here, let's open up the console now, and here you can see it says hello, and then the rendered method is coming up. Now, if I go ahead and make some changes over here, you'll notice that hello has not been called, but rendered has been called one more time. And if I go ahead and reload this page, then only this text hello is appearing. That means no matter how many times this function is getting updated, this method was getting called only once at the time of initialization. So here we save ourselves the expense of reading into local storage on every render. So to review, the problem that we are solving here is that reading into local storage is not necessary except for the initial render of our component. We turn our initial value argument here into a function so that React will call it only when it's necessary to get that initial value, which is only on the first render.